Thank you for joining us at the Generation Green 2021 Youth Conference. This session is brought to you by Dr. Sarah Burch, who is an Associate Professor, Canada Research Chair of Sustainability, Governance, and Innovation at the University of Waterloo, and a scientist on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Burch will be presenting a session on transformative change. Enjoy!
Hi there, my name is Sarah Burch. I'm an Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair at Sustainability, Governance, and Innovation at the University of Waterloo. I'm really happy to be here. I wish we were all in person, but this is the world we live in for the moment. Even so, I'm happy to just take a few minutes, and instead of giving a really formal talk, I'm going to kind of unhook myself from those usual tools of slides and that sort of thing that I'd use for a normal lecture, and just have a conversation with you about a couple of things, about this incredible challenge of climate change that we're all sort of dealing with together. Try and sort of help you take one more step along your path towards figuring out what we know for sure and what we maybe don't know so clearly. I'd like to talk a bit about some work that I've done over the last several years to provide you kind of an insider's perspective into the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm a part of that group of scientists. Talk a bit about my research on sustainability and climate change action in communities, and then kind of wrap up with an attempt at drawing a link between all of the incredible individual actions that you and I and others undertake, and the scale of the challenge and the need for kind of collective action, for action as a group, big, deep decisions about our community. So that's sort of the cluster of issues that I'd like to talk with you about. And I really encourage all of you to Google me if you want, or tweet at me and email me, so that we can keep the conversation going, because I think that this is really exciting, all the work that you're doing and everything I see across Canada, around the world. So you all have learned a lot about climate change, and you're up to speed on sustainability issues, but I just want to sort of hammer home a couple of points that I think are really important. So the most obvious is that the science is very clear, as you know, on the fact that climate is already changing. So this is not climate change, global warming, call it what you will. This isn't a problem that's happening to someone else at some other point in time, some distant future challenge. It's happening right now. We already have observed evidence of rising sea levels. We have observed science on the bleaching of coral reefs in the ocean, because the oceans are getting warmer and also they're getting more acidic. We are seeing kind of these supercharged storms. So not necessarily more frequent, but possibly being more highly energized. So kind of like more dramatic and more damaging, these storms. We also tend to build our communities right in the path of storms, like on low-lying floodplains and that kind of thing. So that's a challenge. We are seeing dramatic impacts on species, of course, mass extinctions of species. So, and also just, challenges to the species that are not yet extinct, but are currently being damaged by a warming climate and our changes in land use. So we're seeing all of that stuff now. We know that we've already witnessed about 1.5 degrees or so, a little over a degree of warming above pre-industrial averages. So that average global temperature before we really started going with the mining, the extraction, and the burning of fossil fuels. So we're committed to that already, and we're on path for 3, 4, or more degrees of warming. But scientists are telling us we really, really need to keep that warming under 2 degrees. And if at all possible, keep that warming to less than 1.5 degrees. So it's happening right now. We know humans are largely responsible. This isn't a natural phenomenon. In the last 800,000 years, we haven't seen levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere like we see today. And it's happening right now. So there we are. That's the doom side of the equation, but I feel so strongly that there is something fundamentally broken about our relationship with nature, the way we use resources, and the way we interact with one another. And climate change is like a very large canary in the coal mine saying something's wrong here. And if you can come to grips with the changes that are necessary to deal with it, we're going to collectively see all sorts of really good things happen, not just a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and managing of climate change. So this is an opportunity to make our communities more livable, to make our communities more beautiful, to make our bodies healthier because we have better access to nature and active transportation, getting on our bikes and walking instead of riding or driving in our cars. We have an opportunity to make our communities more inclusive so that folks from different walks of life can be included in and welcomed into our public spaces and can afford homes in our communities. So I see, as dire as it may appear and is, I see climate change as a really important opening for a conversation among all sorts of people about what sorts of communities we want to live in and how we're going to get there. So that's how I view climate change and sustainability, and it's kind of what keeps me going, working in this field every day. So what is that work, I guess, that I do? Right now, I'm a professor, obviously, at the University of Waterloo, but one of the things that absorbs a lot of my time is working with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So you may have heard of the IPCC, but if you haven't, one of our main approaches, or one of the ones with the longest history to dealing with climate change, has been to get together as a planet to negotiate and to come to some conclusion around, is climate changing? How fast is it changing? Where are those impacts of climate change being felt? Who's being impacted most, through that justice lens? And, spoiler alert or whatever, the people who had the least to do with getting us here, like produce the fewest emissions, are also the ones suffering the most severe impacts. So incredibly important justice dimensions to how this all plays out. So we have this global effort to understand what's happening, understand who's responsible, who should pay, and what level of ambition we should set for our greenhouse gas emissions reductions in 2030, 2050, and on. So that's a negotiation process. That's a political process of coming to those treaties, those agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement after that. Into that process, there needs to be a scientific voice saying, this is what the state of the art on science, climate science is. So that's where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change comes in. This is a really remarkable effort. Really, there's been nothing like it ever in history, and there's nothing really comparable today, where each country, like Canada, that's a member of the United Nations, gets to say, all right, we have these 10 scientists who we would like to put forward to join this global body to try and wrap their arms around all of the climate science and social science that folks are doing around the world to inform that negotiation process. So I'm one of those authors, and I participate in the part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that focuses on greenhouse gas reduction. So that's called Working Group 3. We focus on mitigation, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing carbon sinks. And in particular, this time around, this happens every 5 years or so, what we're really trying to understand is, my chapter at least, accelerating the transition to sustainable development. So not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but how can we take what we already know about how to reduce emissions and speed it up from the local on up to the global level. So that process, it has its critics, and I'm one of them from time to time. It moves slow. We seem to offer pretty conservative recommendations because we need the science to already have backed up what we're saying we need to do. But I want to highlight just how remarkable it is to have truly global collaboration on science of this magnitude, and to have that science directly inform those agreements that we're coming to globally. And those agreements then, like the Paris Agreement, it seems like it can be toothless at times. It's like, what does this even do? And people aren't, countries aren't legally bound to follow those ambitions that they set out. And while on the one hand, I think we can ask more, you and I and everyone can ask more of that process, it's a really powerful process, of having a conversation around what is the scale of the challenge, who's responsible, and then that trickles on down to our domestic policies. So Canada will say, oh, that's what the IPCC is saying we should do internationally. Now this is what we have to do for Canada. The provinces do the same, and your communities, your municipalities base their recommendations on that as well. So the trickle-down effect is enormous. And I think it really has stimulated a lot of the social movements we see, a lot of the activism we see, and a lot of the calls to action. So I'm really proud to be a part of that process, as ridiculously challenging and slow moving as it is. So that's some of what I do. The other part of what I do is a project called Transform. So I am interested in looking wherever I need to look to find really ambitious, transformative sustainability solutions. So I think that the smaller stuff matters, like reducing our use of water, or double side printing our paper, or recycling. I think those are all really important and noble actions. But I'm also really curious about what the deeper shifts look like. Like if we're going to get to net zero, so no more emissions than the planet can take up, or that we can deal with some cool technologies by 2050. That's not a small shift. So we need bigger, deeper changes to the way we do business, to the products we consume, all of that, to the shape of our cities. And so that's what we're working on in Transform. And in particular, we're looking at small businesses. So, a lot of really, really ambitious climate change solutions come out of the small business sector, even though, individually they don't seem particularly powerful, and they're not the Walmarts and the Microsofts of the world, but they actually employ most people who work, in the private sector. So not in government or not in universities like me. Most people in the private sector actually work in small businesses, and they're also really a part of your and my day-to-day life. They're the coffee shop you go to, they're the grocery store you shop at, they're the little, clothing shop down the street, they're the architect's firm, whatever. Those are the small businesses that make up our communities. And what I'm seeing in those small businesses are some of the most ambitious strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions you'll ever see, much more ambitious than you'd see at the national level or by these really big corporations. So I study them because they're ambitious, because they're super creative, because they're really important for our economy. They're also much more inclusive. They're owned and operated by more women, people of color, marginalized groups, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous folks than the large companies are. So I think that they're a really important resource in the transition to this net zero economy that we're trying to get to. And I think it's so important to sort of draw them into the equation and support them as they kind of muddle through this really interesting challenge that we face today. So those are sort of the two main clusters of my work right now that I think might have relevance or resonance with the topics that you're considering through this conference. And I just want to make a couple of points as I sort of wrap up, I guess, which is, I think too often the conversation around who should do what to deal with climate change over the last 3 decades has placed the blame at the feet of individuals. So you should eat less meat or no meat. You should not get a car or get out of your car and get onto your bike. And if you don't, you should feel very bad about yourself. And I think that's problematic. I don't think that's the right way to approach the problem, because there are so many things that you and I do not have control over. You don't have control over how your house was built. You don't have control over how far you have to get from an affordable home to work or to school or to play. Those are decisions that are made for you by your local government, the provincial government, or the federal government. So those are collective decisions. And it's those decisions that actually get at the biggest, the most lasting, the most important sources of emissions. So then what is the role for individuals? So important. So this is how I grapple with it, or this is sort of how I see it in my mind, which is you as individuals and I as an individual need to put as much pressure as we possibly can on the people who make those collective decisions on our behalf. If you're of age, this means voting, for sure, at the very least. If you're not of age to vote, or even if you are and you did vote, that's great. There are other ways of putting pressure on the folks who make decisions on our behalf. Letter writing, protesting if that's your thing, if that's the way that you see your voice being heard. Joining with community groups, your neighborhood association, your cycling advocacy organization, your local food community, joining with those groups so that your voices are magnified and they send the signal to those folks who represent us and make decisions on our behalf that this matters. And of course, all of those individual actions that we're taking do add up. They are part of the sort of groundswell of change, the shifting of our values, of what we think matters, of what's important to us, that is so crucial to this sustainability transition, the transformation to more sustainable communities that we're undergoing right now. So that's how I see this link. My cat would like to make an appearance, between individual action and collective decision making. So while I don't think the blame should be laid at the feet of individuals, I also think that individual action really matters. So that's why I'm so thrilled to hear all of the incredible stories about the cycling advocacy and the local food advocacy and everything that young people like you are undertaking right now. I think that's a really important reason for hope. So I think I'd like to stop there and just say that I think one of the important conversations we're having right now is about all of the ways that addressing climate change, that reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, can also help us to create deeply sustainable communities that deliver on all of the other things that matter to us as well, that deliver on biodiversity, that deliver on public health, that deliver on social inclusion. And I think more often we need to put that lens on when we're thinking about what we're trying to do on climate change. If we have a choice between action A and action B, and action A just reduces emissions, that's great, that's really important, but action B reduces emissions and also does other stuff for us, let's figure out how we can do action B. And there's some really great examples there that I hope we do more of here, in our local communities and across Canada. And one really important cluster is called nature-based solutions, but really that just means strengthening, deepening, enhancing the capacity of nature to do so much that it does so well. So we know, for instance, that forests suck up carbon and they'll help us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions over time. Urban forests are particularly important because we've cleared forests to create these cities we live in. But they do more than that. They can be food forests.